Have you ever been pushed so far down that the only way left to look was up? For Doctor Aris Thorne, rock bottom wasn't a metaphor, it was a physical place. It was the creaking floor of a rusted Airstream trailer, the metallic tang of defeat in the air, and the pitying glances of strangers who saw not a brilliant scientist, but just another single mother who had lost her way. Her ex-husband, the celebrated Doctor Julian Croft, loved to remind her of this fall from grace. He would drive his gleaming German sedan past the dusty track leading to her trailer, a cruel smirk playing on his lips, confident that he had buried her, along with the truth, in a shallow, unmarked grave of poverty and obscurity. He believed he had taken everything. But he was wrong. He never bothered to look closely at the dirt he'd thrown over her, never imagined that deep within that forgotten patch of earth, something extraordinary was waiting to be found. He thought he knew her story, but he had no idea what she was hiding, not in the trailer he mocked, but in the shadows just beyond it. The life Aris Thorne had lost felt like a dream from another person's existence. It was a world of sterile, brightly lit laboratories, the hum of expensive machinery, and the hushed reverence of academic colloquiums. She had thrived in that world, her mind a dizzying whirlwind of molecular structures and enzymatic pathways. She had a partner, not just in life but in science, Doctor Julian Croft, a man whose ambition was as sharp and polished as the glassware in their shared lab. Together, they were on the verge of a breakthrough, a novel gene therapy that promised to rewrite the cruelest sentences of cellular biology. For Aris, this wasn't just abstract science, it was a desperate race against time. Her son, 8-year-old Leo, was a living, breathing deadline. He had been born with a rare genetic disorder, a glitch in his cellular code that caused progressive muscle weakness and a constant, draining fatigue. Every smile from him was a treasure, every labored breath a reminder of the ticking clock. Her research was his only real hope, the fierce, consuming fire of a mother's love forged into scientific rigor. She and Julian had worked for years, their lives intertwined with their research. Aris was the architect, the visionary. Her mind could see the intricate dance of proteins, the subtle language of genetic markers. Julian was the frontman, the charismatic presenter who could charm grant committees and university deans with equal ease. He was handsome, articulate, and possessed a talent for translating her dense, complex theories into palatable soundbites. She thought they were a team, two halves of a whole, pushing the boundaries of medicine together. She was so engrossed in the delicate work, so focused on saving their son, that she never saw the rot growing in the foundation of their life. She missed the way his eyes would linger on her notes, not with collaboration, but with a covetous gleam. She overlooked his increasing possessiveness over their data, his subtle reframing of her ideas as his own during meetings she was too busy in the lab to attend. The end came with the brutal efficiency of a guillotine. The day after she finally stabilized the primary compound, the very key to their entire therapy, Julian filed for divorce. It was a coordinated, surgical strike. His lawyers, a team of pinstriped sharks, descended upon her with a blizzard of paperwork and accusations. They painted her as an unstable, emotionally volatile woman, a mere assistant clinging to the coattails of her brilliant husband. They produced falsified lab logs, edited emails, and even procured a sworn statement from a junior technician, who Julian had bribed, claiming Aris's contributions were minimal and often flawed. Her name, which should have been first on the patent application, was nowhere to be found. It was filed under one name only, Dr. Julian Croft. In the sterile environment of a family courtroom, Aris was systematically dismantled. Her protestations were dismissed as the hysterics of a scorned wife. Her detailed scientific explanations were met with blank stares and impatient sighs from a judge more concerned with asset division than intellectual property. Julian, looking mournful and solemn, spoke of her erratic behavior and her fixation on their son's illness, suggesting it had clouded her judgment. He had stolen her life's work, the very thing she hoped would save their child, and had twisted her maternal devotion into a weapon against her. He was awarded full ownership of the patent, the lab, their beautiful home, and the future they were supposed to share. She was left with a meager, insulting settlement, most of which was immediately devoured by Leo's mounting medical expenses. Her world didn't just shrink, it imploded. From a sprawling modern house with floor-to-ceiling windows, she was thrust into a world of transient motels and the suffocating kindness of friends who couldn't truly understand her ruin. Finally, her last few dollars went toward the only thing she could afford, a forgotten, weed-choked plot of land in the rural outskirts of town, an odd inheritance from a great-uncle she had never met. The property came with a single, derelict Airstream trailer from the 1970s, its silver skin oxidized to a dull, peeling gray. This was her new home. This was her nadir. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Julian made sure she felt it. He would call, his voice dripping with false concern, asking if she and Leo were managing, in their quaint little tin can. Each word was a perfectly aimed dart, designed to remind her that he had won, that she was nothing, and that the world now saw her exactly as he had framed her, a failed scientist and a failing mother, living in a trailer at the edge of nowhere. The Airstream was a monument to decay. During rainstorms, a rhythmic drip 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 from a leak over the small galley kitchen became the soundtrack to Aris's despair. The wiring was a fickle beast, plunging her and Leo into darkness at the most inconvenient times, forcing them to rely on flashlights and candles like campers who had lost their way. Condensation wept down the inside of the curved aluminum walls, and a persistent chill seemed to have settled deep into the trailer's metal bones, a cold that no small space heater could ever truly banish. This was the landscape of her failure. Every peeling bit of laminate, every rust stain in the tiny sink, was a testament to how far she had fallen. She took on remote data entry work, her nimble fingers that once handled delicate pipettes and gene sequencers now mindlessly typing numbers into spreadsheets for pennies a word. The work was soul-crushing, but it kept the single bare bulb lit and bought the cheap pasta and canned soup that now constituted their diet. Leo, bless his heart, tried to make the best of it. He called the trailer their silver spaceship and pretended the flickering lights were due to turbulence as they flew through the cosmos. But Aris saw the truth in his eyes. She saw the quiet resignation when he had to stay inside on days when the damp air made his breathing difficult. She saw the wistful looks he gave the other children at the local library, children who could run and play without a second thought. His illness was a constant, low-grade hum of terror in her life. The experimental treatments prescribed by his doctors were expensive and offered little more than symptom management. The real cure, the one she had poured her soul into, was now being marketed by Julian's new company, Croft Biogen. It was a betrayal so profound it felt like a physical violation, a theft not just of her intellect, but of her son's future. Some days, the hopelessness was an ocean threatening to drown her. She would sit at the cramped dinette table, staring out the grimy window at the tangled mess of overgrown woods that bordered her property, and wonder if this was it. Was this the end of her story? A footnote in Julian's biography? The thought was a spark of fury in the vast coldness of her grief. No. She refused to let him be the author of her final chapter. It was this spark that finally pushed her out the door one crisp autumn afternoon. She needed to do something, anything, besides stare at a spreadsheet. Armed with a rusty pair of shears she'd found under the sink, she began to attack the thorny brambles and invasive vines that were choking the edge of her land. It was mindless, physical work, her frustration and rage fueling every snip and pull. Sweat dripped down her forehead as she carved a small path into the wilderness. And that's when she saw it. Through a thicket of wild sumac, nearly swallowed by a curtain of ivy, was the corner of a man-made structure. Her curiosity, a long-dormant part of her scientific mind, stirred. She pushed deeper, the branches scratching at her arms, until she stood before it. It was a barn, or perhaps a large workshop, clad in weathered, silvered wood, with a steeply pitched roof of corrugated tin. It was old, forgotten, and looked as if it hadn't been touched in half a century. A heavy, rust-caked padlock secured the large double doors. It was a mystery, a solid, tangible thing in a life that had become terrifyingly abstract. She ran her hand over the rough wood. What was inside? Who had built it? This structure wasn't listed on the property deed she'd barely glanced at. It was an anomaly. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, Aris felt a flicker not of despair, but of intrigue. It was a forgotten building on a forgotten piece of land, a perfect match for her forgotten life. Perhaps, she thought, it held more than just dust and cobwebs. Getting into the barn became an obsession. The padlock was an ancient, formidable beast, impervious to her amateur attempts with a hammer and a crowbar she'd found rusting behind the trailer. She was a biochemist, not a burglar. She needed a professional. A search on her phone's spotty internet connection yielded a single result for a local handyman and contractor, Carter Construction. No job too small or too strange. She dialed the number, feeling a pang of embarrassment at her predicament. A man with a low, calm voice answered on the second ring. She explained the situation, feeling foolish as she described the locked barn on her rundown property. He didn't laugh. He simply listened, then said he could be there in an hour. When the dusty blue pickup truck rumbled up her driveway, the man who stepped out was not what she expected. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a quiet competence in his posture. His face was kind, weathered by the sun, and his eyes, a startlingly clear shade of blue, held a friendly intelligence. He introduced himself as Ben Carter. As he looked at her, a flicker of recognition crossed his face. He squinted slightly. Aris Thorne. No way. The Aris Thorne from Northgate High. The one who built that miniature particle accelerator for the state science fair. Aris was floored. It had been nearly 20 years. You remember that? She asked, a genuine smile touching her lips for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Remember it? Ben chuckled, a warm, rumbling sound. Are you kidding? You were a legend. My baking soda volcano never stood a chance. I always wondered what happened to you. I read about you and your husband in the university alumni magazine a few years back. Big shot scientists, he trailed off, sensing the sudden tension in her posture. He had the grace not to press further. Instead, his gaze shifted to the trailer, then back to her, and his expression softened with an unspoken understanding. So, let's take a look at this lock. He made short work of it. With a practiced move, he positioned a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters, and with a single, satisfying snap, the rusted shackle gave way. Together, they pulled on the heavy wooden doors. They groaned in protest, scraping against the dirt floor as they opened, disturbing decades of dust. A shaft of afternoon sunlight pierced the gloom, illuminating a space that took Aris's breath away. It wasn't a barn filled with hay and farming equipment. It was a laboratory. It was dusty, draped in cobwebs, and smelled of earth and old chemicals, but it was unmistakably a lab. Long workbenches lined the walls, laden with glass beakers, distillation coils, and complex-looking machinery she didn't immediately recognize. Shelves were filled with specimen jars containing desiccated plant matter, and thick, leather-bound journals were stacked neatly on a heavy oak desk in the corner. Ben let out a low whistle. Well, I'll be. Looks like your great-uncle was a scientist, too. Aris moved into the space as if in a trance. She ran a finger through the thick layer of dust on a workbench, revealing a clean, stainless steel surface beneath. This wasn't the work of an amateur. The equipment was old but of high quality. There was a gas chromatograph from the 1980s, a centrifuge, and what looked like a custom-built series of growth chambers with sophisticated irrigation systems. It was a botanist's paradise. "My mother mentioned him once," Aris said, her voice barely a whisper. "Uncle Elias. She said he was a recluse. Brilliant, but eccentric. He cut off contact with the family decades ago." She drifted toward the desk and picked up the topmost journal. The cover was stiff, the leather dry and cracked. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was precise, elegant, the ink faded but still legible. "Project Log, Extremophile Flora," the heading read. "Objective: to isolate and synthesize the unique protein compounds responsible for cellular resilience in high-stress environments." Aris's heart began to beat faster. This was not just botany. This was advanced biochemistry. For the next several hours, Aris was lost to the world, poring over her great-uncle's journals while Ben quietly inspected the structural integrity of the barn. Elias Thorne, it turned out, was more than just brilliant. He was a visionary. He had spent his life traveling to the most inhospitable places on Earth, the volcanic vents of the deep sea, the arid plains of the Atacama Desert, the frozen tundra of Siberia, collecting plants that had evolved to survive, even thrive, in conditions that would kill any normal organism. These were his extremophiles. His journals were a meticulous record of his life's work. He documented his discovery of a rare species of lichen that could survive complete dehydration and reanimate with a single drop of water. He wrote of a deep-sea algae that repaired its own cellular damage from crushing pressures and absolute darkness. He wasn't just collecting them, he was breaking them down, searching for the very essence of their durability. As she read, a thrilling, terrifying idea began to form in Aris's mind. The problem with her original gene therapy, the one Julian had stolen, was its instability. The synthetic vector she had designed to carry the corrective gene into cells was effective, but it degraded quickly and sometimes caused an inflammatory response in the host, the dangerous side effects his company was now undoubtedly trying to solve. But what if the carrier didn't need to be synthetic? What if nature had already created a perfect delivery mechanism? Elias's research focused on isolating the very compounds that allowed these extremophile plants to protect and repair their own cellular structures. He was on the verge of synthesizing a chaperone protein, a molecule that could shield and transport other, more fragile molecules, protecting them from environmental stressors. He had been so close. The last entry in his final journal was dated 30 years prior. "The primary stabilizing agent is isolated," he wrote. "But cultivation of the source plant, Saxifraga nocturna, remains impossible outside its native soil. The unique mineral composition of this land appears to be the key. Without a consistent supply, the work cannot proceed." Aris looked up from the journal, her eyes wide with revelation. This land. He wasn't talking about some distant mountain range. He was talking about right here. This forgotten, weed-choked property was the key. Her great-uncle hadn't just been a recluse, he had been a researcher tethered to his one-of-a-kind field site. She looked at the dormant equipment, the shelves of samples, the detailed notes. It wasn't a complete solution, but it was a roadmap. It was the missing piece of her own puzzle. By combining her expertise in gene therapy with his groundbreaking work in botanical biochemistry, she could create something entirely new. A therapy that wasn't just a modification of her stolen work, but a quantum leap beyond it. A stable, naturally derived, and, most importantly, legally distinct therapy that could not only save Leo but could also obliterate Julian's entire empire. It was a staggering possibility, a flicker of light in her endless night. Ben had finished his inspection. "The bones of this place are good," he said, his voice startling her out of her reverie. "Solid foundation, the roof beams are strong. Needs new wiring, a proper power source, and a lot of cleaning. But it's salvageable. It's more than salvageable. He looked from the lab to her, his expression serious. He saw the fire that had been rekindled in her eyes, the way she clutched the journal to her chest like a sacred text. He didn't understand the science, not fully, but he understood purpose when he saw it. He understood the look of a fighter who had just been handed a sword. "What do you need, Aris?" he asked, his voice low and steady. It was the first time in months anyone had asked her what she needed, instead of telling her what she had lost. The question was a lifeline. "I need to bring this place back to life," she said, her voice filled with a conviction that surprised even herself. "I need a lab." Ben nodded slowly, a small smile playing on his lips. "All right then," he said. "Let's build you a lab." That was the moment their alliance was forged. He was no longer just a contractor, and she was no longer just a client. They were partners in a mission that felt both impossible and absolutely necessary. The transformation of the barn became their shared obsession. The first challenge was power. The trailer's flimsy connection was barely enough for a coffee maker, let alone a laboratory. Ben, with his deep knowledge of rural infrastructure, found a solution. He spent 2 days trenching and laying new, heavy-gauge conduit from the main road, painstakingly connecting it to a new breaker panel he installed on the barn's exterior wall. He worked with a quiet, focused intensity that Aris found deeply calming. While he wrestled with wires and grounding rods, she began the Herculean task of cleaning. She scrubbed decades of grime from the workbenches, meticulously cleaned every piece of glassware, and catalogued her great-uncle's vast collection of samples and chemicals. The work was exhausting, but with every square foot of floor she swept, with every dusty beaker that emerged sparkling from its soapy bath, she felt as though she were scrubbing away the filth of her own despair. As they worked, a comfortable rhythm developed between them. They talked for hours. Aris, hesitant at first, found herself opening up about Julian, the betrayal, and the gnawing fear for Leo's health. Ben listened without judgment, his quiet empathy a balm on her raw wounds. He, in turn, told her about his life, about leaving the city after a messy divorce of his own, seeking the peace and simplicity of working with his hands. He spoke of his love for bringing old things back to life, whether it was a vintage truck engine or a dilapidated building. "Everything deserves a second chance," he said one afternoon, looking at the emerging laboratory, but Aris knew he was talking about more than just the barn. He saw her, not as the broken woman the world perceived, but as the brilliant, resilient person she was struggling to become again. His belief in her was a scaffold, supporting her as she rebuilt herself from the ruins. Leo, initially shy around the big, quiet man, quickly grew to adore him. Ben had a gentle, patient way with the boy. He would take breaks from his work to show Leo how to properly handle a drill, or to explain the principles of an electrical circuit in simple terms. He even built a small, raised garden bed just outside the barn door, where he and Leo planted tomatoes and basil. For the first time in a long time, Aris saw her son truly happy, his laughter echoing through the trees, a sound more precious than any scientific breakthrough. One evening, after a particularly long day of work, Ben found a scruffy, underfed stray dog sniffing around the trailer. He coaxed it over with a piece of his sandwich, and within an hour, the dog, whom Leo immediately named Sprocket, had curled up on the rug at their feet, a loyal, furry sentinel. In this strange, secluded corner of the world, a makeshift family was beginning to form. With the lab cleaned and powered, the real work began. Aris turned her full attention to her great-uncle's final, cryptic entry. Saxifraga nocturna. The night-flowering saxifrage. According to his notes, it was a small, unassuming plant with fleshy leaves that grew only in the rocky, mineral-rich soil of this specific plot of land. After days of searching, she finally found a patch of it growing in a shaded, mossy crevice behind the barn. It looked utterly ordinary. Yet, within its cells, it held the secret to a medical revolution. Following Elias's partial schematics, and with Ben's help engineering the hardware, Aris set up a small-scale hydroponic system inside the lab. She carefully transplanted several specimens of the saxifrage into a nutrient bath that mimicked the local soil's unique mineral composition. Now, she could cultivate a consistent supply. She worked with a fervor she hadn't felt in years. Her mind, once clouded with grief and anxiety, was now sharp, clear, and utterly consumed. The laboratory became her sanctuary. Late at night, with Leo asleep in the trailer and the soft hum of the equipment as her only companion, she delved deep into the molecular mysteries of the plant. She isolated the chaperone protein her uncle had discovered, a beautifully complex molecule she named Eleusine, in his honor. Then came the critical step, integrating it with her own gene therapy vector. It was the most delicate work of her life. Day after day, she ran simulations, tested compounds, and analyzed the results. There were failures, moments of frustration where the data made no sense and she felt the old despair creeping back in. But then she would look at a picture of Leo taped to the wall, or Ben would appear at the door with a hot cup of coffee and a quiet, encouraging word, and she would push forward. One rainy Tuesday, it happened. She introduced the combined Eleusine vector compound to a petri dish of cultured human cells that mimicked Leo's condition. Watching through the microscope, she held her breath. The results were astounding. The Eleusine protein acted as a perfect shield, guiding the corrective gene into the target cells with unparalleled efficiency. The vector was not only stable, but the host cells showed zero signs of inflammation or rejection. It worked. It was elegant, natural, and 1,000 times more effective than the clumsy, unstable formula Julian was trying to push through clinical trials. As proof of concept, she synthesized a small amount of the stabilizing agent and applied it to a sickly tomato plant in Leo and Ben's garden that was yellowed and wilting. Within 48 hours, the plant was a vibrant green, its leaves reaching for the sun, a new, healthy shoot emerging from its stem. It was life, resurrected. While Aris focused on the science, Ben's practical nature led him to a different kind of discovery. While organizing the old office in the barn, he found a metal box tucked away in a dusty cabinet. Inside was a treasure trove of documents, old property deeds, geological surveys of the land commissioned by Aris Thorne, and a stack of correspondence between her great-uncle and a mineralogy professor at the state university. The letters and surveys confirmed what Elias had suspected: the land was situated over a unique geological formation, a deposit of rare earth minerals that were not known to exist anywhere else in the region. It was this specific mineral cocktail that gave Saxifraga nocturna its extraordinary properties. This wasn't just a piece of land, it was a priceless natural resource. More importantly, Ben's discovery provided an ironclad, geological basis for her new patent, rooting her discovery in this specific, privately owned location. Aris began meticulously documenting every single step of her new process. She filled notebooks with her data, took time-stamped photographs of her results, and saved every digital file to multiple encrypted hard drives. She was building an unassailable fortress of intellectual property, a fortress built on a foundation of her great-uncle's legacy and her own renewed genius. She was no longer the victim. She was a scientist on the brink of a discovery that would change everything, and this time, she had the proof. She was creating not just a cure, but the evidence that would finally bring Julian Croft to his knees. News travels, even to the isolated corners of the world. In the gleaming chrome and glass headquarters of Croft Biogen, Dr. Julian Croft was growing increasingly agitated. His flagship product, the gene therapy he had named Croftogen, was in trouble. The instability issues that Aris had warned him about years ago were now causing significant problems in his Phase 2 clinical trials. Test subjects were experiencing severe inflammatory reactions, and the therapeutic effect was disappointingly temporary. His investors, a notoriously impatient group of venture capitalists, were getting nervous. The company's stock, once a darling of the biotech world, had begun to stagnate. Julian was under immense pressure, and his carefully constructed facade of effortless brilliance was beginning to crack. It was during a tense board meeting that he first heard her name again. One of the investors, a man named Marcus Thorne, no relation, a cruel irony, casually mentioned a rumor he'd heard from a colleague at the university. "Something about your ex-wife, Julian. I heard she's living in a trailer park somewhere, puttering around with plants. A sad story, really." Such a waste of a good mind. Julian forced a condescending laugh. "Aris was always more of a hobbyist than a scientist, Marcus. She's probably trying to grow prize-winning pumpkins. It's for the best." She couldn't handle the pressure of real science, but inwardly, a cold seed of suspicion was planted. Aris and plants. It felt wrong. She was a molecular biologist, not a gardener. What was she really doing? The thought was a persistent itch he couldn't scratch. His unease festered. He hired a private investigator, a former cop with a cheap suit and shifty eyes, to look into her. The man's instructions were simple: find out what Aris was up to, but be discreet. A week later, the investigator's report landed on his desk. It was mostly what he expected: grainy photos of the dilapidated trailer, the overgrown property, the boy who looked too pale. But there was one detail that made Julian sit up straight. The report mentioned a large, recently repaired barn on the property. "Subject appears to spend most of her time in the structure," the report read. "Lights are on at all hours. A man, identified as local contractor Benjamin Carter, is also a frequent presence. Power consumption to the property has increased tenfold in the last 2 months, tenfold." His mind raced. That wasn't the power consumption of a hobbyist. That was the power consumption of serious equipment. Panic, cold and sharp, began to replace his arrogance. Could she be trying to replicate their work? It seemed impossible. She had no resources, no lab, no funding. And yet, he knew her mind. He knew her tenacity. He remembered the way she could solve problems that had left entire teams stumped. He immediately had his legal team draft a cease and desist letter. It was a masterpiece of intimidation, full of dense legal jargon and veiled threats, warning her of the dire consequences of infringing upon his patented intellectual property. He sent it via courier, imagining her receiving it in her little tin can, imagining her fear and her inevitable surrender. It was a warning shot, designed to scare her back into the obscurity where he believed she belonged. The letter arrived on a sunny afternoon. Aris read it, her hand steady, a cold fury rising within her. The sheer audacity of it, the gall of the man who had stolen everything from her to accuse her of theft, was breathtaking. Ben read it over her shoulder, his jaw tightening. "He's scared," Ben said, his voice a low growl. "This isn't the move of a man who's confident. This is a bully trying to frighten you." Aris looked up from the letter, her eyes meeting his. "He should be scared," she said softly. She took the letter, walked over to the small wood-burning stove Ben had installed in the lab, and fed it to the flames. Watching it turn to ash was deeply satisfying. She would not be intimidated. She would not stop. Her silence was the one response Julian had not anticipated. It was an act of defiance that sent a jolt of genuine fear through him. If she wasn't scared, it meant she had something he didn't know about. His desperation began to curdle into something uglier, more dangerous. The subtle threats gave way to direct action. One night, the entire property was plunged into darkness. It wasn't the trailer's faulty wiring this time, the main power line from the road had been deliberately cut. Ben, his face grim, spent the next day repairing it and reinforcing the connection point. A few days later, a crisp white van from Child Protective Services pulled into her driveway. A stern-faced woman informed Aris that they had received an anonymous tip about a sick child being raised in an unstable and hazardous environment. Aris, her heart pounding with terror, had to walk the woman through the trailer and the lab, explaining Leo's condition, showing her his medical records, and proving that despite the unconventional setting, he was loved and well cared for. The woman eventually left, satisfied, but the visit left Aris shaken to her core. Julian would stoop to anything. He would use their own son as a weapon against her. The final escalation was the most terrifying. Ben came running from the trailer one morning, his face pale. Sprocket, their loyal, gentle dog, was lying on the floor, whimpering, his body trembling. He had been poisoned. Aris's scientific mind kicked into high gear, identifying the likely toxin from the symptoms and administering a makeshift antidote from her lab supplies. They rushed Sprocket to the vet, who confirmed her diagnosis, a potent, fast-acting poison, likely left out in a piece of meat. The dog would live, but the message was clear. This was no longer about lawsuits and intimidation. This was a direct threat to their safety. The protective bubble of their secluded world had been breached. Ben's face was a mask of cold fury. That same day, he installed a state-of-the-art security system, complete with motion-activated floodlights and cameras covering every approach to the property. The barn, once a place of discovery and hope, now felt like a fortress under siege. The stakes had been raised from professional ruin to life and death. Aris knew then that she had to accelerate her timeline. She had to finish her work before Julian's desperation drove him to do something truly unforgivable. The poison incident was a brutal catalyst. It extinguished any lingering hesitation in Aris's mind and replaced it with a diamond-hard resolve. Fear was a luxury she could no longer afford, it had to be transmuted into action. She worked with an almost supernatural focus, the hum of the centrifuge and the quiet bubbling of beakers becoming the rhythm of her life. She refined the eleusine purification process, increasing the yield from each small plant. She perfected the delivery mechanism, creating a final serum that was not just stable but remarkably potent. The last round of cellular trials was flawless. The data was unequivocal, a beautiful, perfect cascade of numbers that spelled out hope. She had done it. Her formula, the Leo formula, as she now called it in her heart, was complete. It was her masterpiece, born from betrayal, nurtured by love, and perfected in secret. Now, she needed a different kind of weapon. Science was not enough, she needed to wield the truth like a sword in the world of law and public opinion. Ben, seeing the grim determination in her eyes, made a call. "There's a journalist I trust," he told her. "Her name is Sarah Jenkins. She's tenacious, and she hates bullies, especially corporate ones. And I know a lawyer. A guy who built his career taking on patent trolls and pharmaceutical giants. He's expensive, but he's the best." Within 2 days, they were all gathered in the lab. Sarah Jenkins was a sharp, perceptive woman in her 40s with eyes that missed nothing. The lawyer, a formidable man named David Chen, listened intently, his expression unreadable, as Aris laid out the entire story. She told them about her initial research with Julian, his betrayal, the theft of her work, the fraudulent divorce settlement, and the subsequent campaign of intimidation. Then, with a calm confidence that silenced the room, she presented her new research. She showed them the data, the molecular models, the physical evidence of the rejuvenated tomato plant, and the geological surveys of the land. David Chen leaned forward, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "Dr. Thorne," he said, his voice resonating with admiration. "This is not just a lawsuit. This is a declaration of war. He didn't just steal your intellectual property, he built his entire company on a fraudulent foundation. And you haven't infringed on his patent, you've created a new technology that makes his obsolete and proves his is dangerously flawed. The corporate sabotage, the threats, the attempt to use child protective services, this is a criminal case waiting to happen. Sarah Jenkins was already typing furiously into her laptop. This is explosive, she murmured. A betrayed female scientist, a sick child, a secret lab, a corporate villain. This is the story of the year. But we need to catch him in the act. We need his reaction. On the record, the plan began to take shape, a final, decisive confrontation, meticulously orchestrated to expose Julian for who he truly was. Julian, meanwhile, was spiraling. His company's stock was in freefall after a damaging leak about the trial's side effects. His investors were calling for his resignation. He was a cornered animal, and in his desperation, he made a fatal error in judgment. He decided he needed to handle Aris himself. He believed that if he could just get in a room with her, he could use the force of his personality, their shared history, the weight of his power and wealth, to crush her will. He would make her sign a non-disclosure agreement so airtight it would bury her forever. He drove out to her property himself, his sleek black car a jarring intrusion in the quiet, rural landscape. He brought 2 of his corporate security men with him, large, imposing figures meant to intimidate. He strode up the path, his expensive suit immaculate, a smirk of anticipated victory on his face. He expected to find her in the squalid trailer, to see her flinch at the sight of him. He knocked on the trailer door. No answer. He tried the handle, it was unlocked. He peered inside. It was empty. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. Then he saw the path leading to the barn, now well trodden, with a new, sturdy door. He marched toward it, his men following close behind. He threw the door open without knocking, ready to unleash his fury. And then he froze. The sight before him was so incongruous, so utterly impossible, that his brain struggled to process it. He was not in a dusty, dilapidated barn. He was standing in a gleaming, state-of-the-art laboratory, humming with the quiet power of advanced technology. And there was Aris. She wasn't weeping in a corner. She was standing at a central workbench, wearing a clean white lab coat, her posture radiating a calm, unshakable confidence he had never seen before. She was not alone. Ben Carter stood beside her, his arms crossed, his expression like granite. A well-dressed man who radiated legal authority stood on her other side, holding a briefcase. And in the corner, a woman was holding up a professional-grade camera, its red recording light glowing like a malevolent eye. Julian, Aris said, her voice clear and cold, devoid of the emotion he expected. I've been expecting you. Julian's face went slack with shock, his prepared speech dying on his lips. What is this? He stammered, gesturing wildly at the lab. This is my work, Julian, she said, her voice ringing with authority. My new work. She calmly walked him through it. She explained the principles of Eliasine, the superiority of her naturally derived vector, the stability, the efficacy. She presented her data on a large monitor, charts and graphs that proved her Leo formula was not only a breakthrough but that it rendered his Croftogen obsolete and demonstrably dangerous. It's not an infringement of your patent, because your patent is based on a flawed, inferior design, she concluded. This is an entirely new class of therapy. And I own it. All of it. Then David Chen stepped forward. Dr. Croft, he began, his tone lethally polite. My name is David Chen, and I represent Dr. Thorne. We will be filing a multi-pronged lawsuit against you and Croft Biogen. The first part will be for the original intellectual property theft, based on new evidence we have uncovered regarding the fraudulent nature of your initial patent filing. The second will be for damages related to corporate espionage and a campaign of illegal harassment, including the deliberate severing of power lines and the filing of a malicious and false report to Child Protective Services. Sarah Jenkins then stepped forward, the camera still trained on his face. "Dr. Croft," she asked, her voice sharp. Sarah Jenkins, from the Global Science Chronicle. "Can you comment on the recent reports of severe adverse reactions in your Croftogen clinical trials? And can you respond to Dr. Thorne's assertion that your product is fundamentally unstable, a fact she claims you have been aware of for years?" The trap had sprung. The walls were closing in. Every word Aris and her team spoke was a hammer blow, shattering the foundations of his world. His face, a canvas of disbelief, cycled through shock, rage, and finally, raw, primal fear. The smirk was gone, replaced by the wild-eyed panic of a man watching his life burn to the ground. You can't," he sputtered, his voice cracking. This is my life's work." He made a desperate, irrational lunge toward the workbench, his hand reaching out as if to smash the vials of her precious serum, to destroy the evidence of his own obsolescence. Before he could take a second step, Ben was there, moving with a speed that belied his size. He didn't touch Julian. He simply placed himself between Julian and the research, an immovable object of quiet strength. The two security men took a half-step forward, but hesitated, their bravado evaporating in the face of a lawyer and a journalist with a running camera. Checkmate. Julian stood there, trembling, his composure utterly shattered, exposed for the thief and the fraud he was. He stared at Aris, at the woman he had tried to erase, and saw not a victim, but his executioner. Without another word, he turned and fled, his men scrambling after him, a defeated king abandoning his castle. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for Julian Croft. Sarah Jenkins's story, complete with video of Julian's stunned, guilty face, went viral. It was picked up by every major news outlet, a sensational tale of betrayal, resilience, and vindication. The stock of Croft Biogen didn't just fall, it evaporated, plummeting to zero in a matter of hours as the market reacted to the dual bombshell of a fraudulent foundation and a dangerous, failing product. The FDA immediately launched a full-scale investigation into Croftogen, halting the clinical trials and unsealing documents that confirmed the severe side effects Julian had tried to conceal. His investors, led by the now furious Marcus Thorne, filed a massive lawsuit against him for fraud and gross mismanagement. Within a week, Julian Croft was arrested. The charges were extensive: corporate fraud, intellectual property theft, perjury from the original divorce hearing, and multiple counts related to the corporate sabotage against Aris. The man who had everything lost it all in the most public and humiliating way imaginable. His empire had been built on a lie, and a single, determined woman, working from a barn, had spoken the truth that brought it all crashing down. For Aris, the victory was sweet, but the true rewards were far more profound. With David Chen's expert guidance, the original divorce settlement was reopened and thrown out. A new judgment recognized her as the co-inventor of the original therapy and the sole inventor of the new, superior Leo formula. She was awarded a settlement so significant that it not only restored her financial security but also provided the seed funding for her future. She didn't sell her patent. Instead, on her own terms, she entered into a partnership with a well-respected, ethical pharmaceutical company to bring the Leo formula to market. She retained full control over the research and development, ensuring that her discovery would be used for good, not for greed. The name Dr. Aris Thorne, once erased from the annals of science, was now celebrated. She was a symbol of innovation, integrity, and the incredible power of a mother's resolve. She bought the sprawling acreage adjacent to her small plot of land, not to build a mansion, but with a vision for the Thorne Institute for Cellular Restoration, a state-of-the-art research facility dedicated to pursuing her great-uncle's legacy and her own. The greatest victory, however, was the one that happened quietly, away from the headlines and the courtrooms. The Leo formula, fast-tracked due to its incredible promise and safety profile, was administered to her son. The changes were slow at first, then miraculous. The fatigue that had shadowed his entire life began to lift. The strength returned to his limbs. He began to run, to climb, to play with an energy that brought tears to Aris's eyes. One sunny afternoon, she watched from the porch of the trailer as Leo and Ben had a race across the lawn, Leo's laughter, pure and unlabored, echoing through the air. Sprocket barked excitedly, running circles around them. In that moment, Aris felt a sense of peace so deep it settled in her very soul. She had not just defeated a villain, she had saved her son. Her partnership with Ben had blossomed into a deep and abiding love. He was her rock, her confidant, and her partner in every sense of the word. He had stood by her when she had nothing, and he stood by her now, not in the shadow of her success, but as an equal, the co-architect of their new life. They were a family, forged in adversity and bound by loyalty and love. The trailer, the rusty symbol of her lowest point, was not discarded. They lovingly restored it, polishing its silver skin until it gleamed, turning it into a beautiful, cozy guesthouse. It was a permanent reminder, not of her shame, but of her resilience. It was the chrysalis from which she had emerged, transformed. The barn remained the heart of their world, the sacred space where a forgotten legacy and a mother's love had converged to create a miracle. One evening, as the sun set, casting long, golden shadows across their land, Aris, Ben, and Leo stood on a small hill overlooking the site of the future institute. On a portable table before them, the architectural blueprints were laid out, rippling in the gentle breeze. Aris looked from the plans to her son, who was now explaining the principles of a cantilevered roof to Ben with all the seriousness of an 8-year-old engineer. She looked at Ben, whose hand found hers, his touch warm and familiar. She had lost a life she thought she wanted, only to build a new one that was infinitely more real, more meaningful, and more profoundly joyful. She had been mocked for living in a trailer, for being cast out into the dirt. But her enemies had never understood that for a scientist, for a mother, for a survivor, the dirt is not an end. It is where you plant the seeds of the future. And her future, she knew, was going to be extraordinary.